there's nothing more emblematic of strength. There's no greater example of being a warrior than being able to look within, recognize you need to get the help you need, and then actually doing it.
Welcome to the Transition Drill Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Pantiani. I appreciate you taking the time to watch, so let's get into this. When you started the Resiliency Project, did you ever have any idea that it would grow as much as it's been, and to the point where you're basically on the road almost every day of your life, it seems like?
Never, no. And it's been a blessing because we've been able to really connect with a lot more people who need our help.
How are you able to get through, well, like we talked previously, I'm sure hearing these stories every day almost makes you relive your trauma. Is that an issue for you? Or what are you doing to keep yourself well even through all this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think definitely the stories that we hear certainly impact me. My heart breaks for those that do reach out for us. And yeah, some of them are very triggering and can bring me back. So my self-care plan, especially with the increase of peer support calls that we've gotten, has really tripled. So the things that I do for self-care are quintessential for me because I'm not going to ever go backwards. And now that I know what I need to do to be healthy and mentally and emotionally and spiritually sound, I have to be able to practice what I preach. And so, I go on 3-4 walks a day and have a whole self-care plan that has kicked into high gear, especially in the last year with everything that we're seeing and the stories that we're hearing. It is hard. And I think that, at the end of the day, I have to put the oxygen mask on myself before I can help anybody. And really, it's my team and my fiance and my own, family social structure that has really helped me because I wouldn't be able to do anything without the team, my fiance, my family. And so, a combination between my self-care plan and my, own support group is what's keeping me going.
Well, you bring up a great point. For all of us, our mental health is a component of those that we have around us. And if we don't have a strong team around us that are encouraging us and trying to make us better, I hate to say it, we're almost destined to fail.
100%. One thing I've learned is that, there's no magic pill. And so when I was going through a trauma retreat, the one thing that really stuck with me is that there's no better way to heal than to have a healthy family or social structure, people around you to lift you up, to motivate you, to be there for you when it gets hard. And so I'm so grateful for that. It's not something that I've really had before, so these last couple of years have been a true blessing. And I also believe that for as difficult as the stories are to hear, being able to deal with things, being able to hear the stories and kind of take all that in and absorb it, I think makes me stronger. Because if I'm able to withstand it and not go backwards and practice what I preach, I feel like I'm getting more resilient every day.
What was it like for you the first time you stood in front of a crowd and told them your story?
I cried like a baby. And I don't think I lasted more than a few minutes before I just completely broke down because I was so raw. And that happened shortly after I medically retired. But and even today I get emotional reliving some of the stuff or sharing my story because I see sometimes the reaction in some of the people's faces. And I know that my story is not unique. And a lot of the things that I say are triggering the people that are hearing it, and they come up and they tell me afterwards, and it's emotional. But I think in this industry, in law enforcement, we've typically learned that vulnerability is danger. Being vulnerable and being emotional in front of other people has been a sign of weakness. And my whole opinion on that has changed. And so I think it's okay to get emotional. And I think it's how we respond, or how I respond to reliving events, hearing the things that I hear, or speaking in front of people, that also is very cathartic and adds to my healing, if that makes sense. It's pain is something that we typically avoid, right? And avoidance is a huge factor to post-traumatic stress. It's something that so many of us do. But I've learned, and I believe that if you don't avoid the things that are really affecting you, and you're able to push through it in a way that's positive and not self-destructive, it makes you stronger.
The job, it's kind of funny, you talked about it doesn't encourage or embrace emotions, or emotions, if you cry, you're considered weak, but it does encourage or at least embrace anger. And that's an emotion too. People don't see that there's two sides of it. And getting to the core of what's us, it's about dealing with our emotions. And like you just brought out, we tend to avoid, or we bury away the stuff that we perceive, or what our peers perceive is weak or negative. And that's what we need to move forward and get rid of that stigma.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that when we hold things in, and when we're afraid of or worried about what our peers think, or our immediate surrounding, environment is, and what people's perceptions of us are, we bury things. And over a course of time, when officers or any first responder is dealing with cumulative stress and trauma, critical incident after critical incident, I think that sometimes our cup becomes full, boils over. And that's when we start seeing the kind of problems that I experienced and thousands others around the country are experiencing. And so if we did more to try to normalize our normal reactions to these abnormal events that we see in law enforcement, I think it would be a game changer if we reframe the way that we think about how we respond as human beings, rather than being a little bit more robotic with a badge and having to put on a facade. I think that we would have a lot fewer suicides, a lot fewer incidents where first responders, particularly law enforcement officers, are losing their jobs because of mistakes, or dealing with untreated trauma. And so we have to kind of, in my opinion, normalize we have to normalize mental health, and we have to really embrace the idea that it is okay to not be okay, right? And that getting help is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. In my career, I was part of the problem. I very judgmental. I hid my emotions. I looked down on, any idea that being emotional after a tragedy, responding to the heinous things that people do to one another, would be a sign of weakness. Case in point, I remember going to my first police funeral. I was in the passenger seat taking video of the community members in the procession on the sidewalks, holding American flags, standing there with their hands over their hearts. And I was trying so hard not to cry in front of my partner who was driving. And I look back at that and I think, that stigma that has really permeated throughout the law enforcement profession is I think it's our biggest problem in the profession, that stigma. And I think it has everything to do with, if we're able to overcome stigma, I think that we can teach officers to live happy, healthy lives we normalize mental health and create pathways towards healing, we're going to save more. And that's, we're dying more by our own hands than in the line of duty. And that's been a real tragedy because these are preventable deaths.
Well, in the profession itself, it onboards people who are very, per se, young. Early 20s, you don't have everything figured out yet. And so to then put them into situations of extreme stress without the proper tools to deal with them, the propensity for mental health issues is there. It's inherent in the job, but it doesn't get acknowledged. And we've got the old adage or the old way of thinking of just suck it up, buttercup, go deal with it. And we're now starting to see more and more that are getting impacted by what they're experiencing in their careers.
Sure. And I agree wholeheartedly with that. We know, and we train, from the academy on, we know that we're going to experience hellacious things. We're going to see horrible things and tragedies and death and carnage and destruction. And we're trained how to deal with those things in a tactical environment. We're trained how to, collect evidence, how to interview people. We expect that we're going to experience those things, but we're not trained in a preventative way from day one. We're not trained how to deal with how the impacts of trauma are going to affect us, untreated trauma. And the stigma is so palpable. Day one in the academy, right? We're constantly being assessed and judged, but more so by our own peers, because the importance of peer solidarity and peer acceptance is quintessential, and it is so for survival. When you're going through a door with someone, you have to know and believe that your partner is going to be able to neutralize a threat if you go down or save your life and be tactically proficient or sound. And it's for those very reasons. And it's something that Dr. John Violante and Kevin Gilmartin talk about frequently in their books. That very same survival instinct and the will to survive that they teach us in the academy is part of, which is necessary, is part of why there's so much stigma. Amongst other things, fitness for duties, organizational behavior, and how agencies respond to mental health stuff. So, yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And I just think that we could do a lot more to advance the profession because we do not have to be losing as many as we're losing, and not just to suicide, but breakdown of the family structure, the divorces, making mistakes on the job, not sleeping enough. And it doesn't have to, in my opinion, be so prevalent. And I think if we prioritize prioritize mental health and law enforcement from the top down leadership, I think sets the tone. And so I think that going beyond that, I think that we can improve community relations if we have healthier cops. I've said before that society is not going to benefit from sick cops. So, we owe it to our cops and their families to make this a priority.
You started the Resiliency Project, obviously, and we're going to definitely get there. But let's go backwards a little bit. Where's hometown for you?
San Diego.
So born and raised San Diego?
Born and raised, yeah. And when my mother was remarried, when I was about to be a freshman in high school, moved up to the Bay Area. And then that's where I became an explorer. And then I came back down when I was 20 and went through the San Diego Regional Police Academy.
So you got into law enforcement as an officer what year?
2005.
And was law enforcement in your family?
No.
So no brothers, sisters, family?
Nope.
But did you know you wanted to be a cop from early on?
It was actually because one day in high school I was having a bad day. I don't even remember why I was emotional, but I was sitting on the sidewalk with my head down and in a small town in Northern California, and this police officer pulls up, and I thought he was going to mess with me, and I'm like, oh, geez, the cops, right? And he said, hey, man, looks like you're having a bad day. Let me cheer you up. You want to see the inside of my patrol car? I didn't know really where he was going with this. He let me sit in the patrol car. I looked at all the buttons and saw what he was doing, heard the radio traffic, and gave me an application to be an explorer. And I'm 15 years old, and I ended up becoming an explorer. And every single weekend I rode with either him or other officers at that agency throughout the entire shift. And I fell in love with the profession, what it stood for. I believed in the nobility of it, justice. I've always believed in, our system of jurisprudence, and kind of a nerd in like studying that stuff. But I thought that the honor of being a police officer and serving the community was a really noble thing. And that's kind of how I got into it. And I knew from my first ride along that that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. There was nothing else in my head that I could be happier doing than being a police officer.
Was there ever anything on your radar prior to that you thought you might want to do?
Thought I was going to be a soccer player. But that changed. When I was younger, when I was in San Diego, I played for a club soccer team, the Surf, and I thought I wanted to, take that all the way and maybe go into coaching. But no, everything changed when I had my first ride along. And we went to a domestic violence call one time, I remember. And I obviously had to sit in the car, but I saw that the officer pulled a husband out of the house who had just beat his wife. And as he was bringing her back to the car, the unit, she came out of the house, and you could see the relief in her face. And I knew then, like, this is what I wanted to do.
And so what year was this that you got into, not as an explorer, but when you went to the academy?
2003.
2003. Through your career, several different agencies?
Yeah, I started off in San Diego at a community college police department, and then lateral to a municipal agency in Orange County.
You ultimately medically retired from your second agency, and we'll get there, but you dealt with some back issues or back surgeries, from what I understand, correct?
Yeah, I had got injured, and I had a couple back surgeries, and later had another surgery on my arm from all work-related stuff, and still deal with that stuff today. But that's kind of where things started to change for me.
And what was the first thing that you noticed as far as a change?
The first thing was my inability to sleep, which I had never experienced before. And so when I had lateraled to Orange County and during my patrol days, I wasn't able to relax. I wasn't able to calm down after work. And I became a complete insomniac. And one day would sometimes turn into 2 days, and at my worst, 3 days of no sleep. And I really thought and felt like something is not right with me. And so I started going to the doctor to try to get sleep aids, and they started prescribing me trazodone and then Ambien. Nothing was working. So I knew something was wrong then, but I also was around that time or shortly thereafter being prescribed pain medication, muscle relaxers after the surgeries. And then it kind of went from there. The doctor said, we're no longer able to treat you in our sleep program. We have to send you to a psychiatrist for medication management. And I thought, oh my gosh, like the stigma of having to do that was mortifying for me. And I was super, embarrassed, and it was a tough thing for me to do. But I went. They diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress, and I thought that was just military, from military personnel. But I was really just I felt really ashamed and embarrassed, and part of me just thought I was really weak and not as tough as the other guys or gals. And during that time, they prescribed me benzodiazepines, and that's kind of what led to my eventual downfall.
But did the doctors determine that the lack of sleep or inability to sleep was directly related to the PTSD?
Yeah. Mm.
what were some of the indicators early on? Obviously, you weren't sleeping, but looking back on it, was there anything significant that you can attribute that to?
Yeah, I remember distinctly not being able to, aside from not being able to sleep, I started changing, right? I started isolating from people more. I started, on my days off, I didn't want to leave the house. I would sleep and sometimes just watch TV. I isolated from my own family. I didn't want to talk about, much. And so that was not who I was before, right? I was always outgoing but I started to kind of withdraw from all my social structures. And I also became very hypervigilant. Hypervigilance on duty is normal and, can save your life, right?
Not 24 hours a day.
But not 24 hours a day. And so when I was, getting a little bit more hypervigilant, my anxiety went up and I just thought, something was wrong. So there was a combination of a lot of different things.
Did you find yourself pulling away from even the people that you were working with?
I did. Because I was, and this goes back to that peer context of law enforcement and how important peer solidarity and peer acceptance is in law enforcement, right? I never wanted to feel like I was invalidated or they couldn't trust me. So when I was exhausted sometimes, I'd walk into work looking like a zombie, or I would, I just didn't want them to think something was wrong. So I, over the course of time, started to withdraw from them. And there's a lot of different factors that go into that. But at the end of the day, I didn't feel good about myself, and knowing that something just wasn't right, it caused me to kind of withdraw from everyone with varying degrees, right? I mean, I tried to put on a good facade, but I was slowly starting to live a lie. I wasn't, it's hard to look in the mirror sometimes because I started to, as a result of untreated trauma and cumulative stress, and because of the stigma that's so prevalent, the fear of reaching out for help never even crossed my mind, because early on, since I was a cadet, it's not something that was ever encouraged or talked about. So my maladaptive coping strategies started to increase. My adaptive coping strategies decreased. So did my resilience. And I started to numb out on the medications that were being prescribed to me. And over the course of time, I became chemically dependent.
Now, your perspective is looking back on in hindsight a little bit. At the time you were going through this, did you ever correlate any of this with mental health, or what did you think was going on with you?
I didn't know. I didn't think, I never even thought about mental health. I didn't know anything about post-traumatic stress. I didn't know, I knew nothing about how the impacts of trauma impact us. I had no clue. And so I just thought I was changing and didn't like what I was becoming. And that's probably why I started to withdraw and isolate, because I didn't want people to view me as something other than a good partner that could be there for them when they needed me.
What kind of support were you getting from your family or those you worked with? Were they at least reaching out or kind of letting you flounder on your own?
I think, looking back now, we all deal with trauma differently, and I didn't know anything about transfer trauma. I'd want to come home and tell war stories sometimes, and by and large, family really didn't want to hear it, not because they didn't care, but because they were worried and about, what would happen to me. So it probably increased their own level of anxiety. And so, no, I didn't, their reaction to what I was going through was not, how do I put this? It wasn't, their reaction to what I was going through wasn't emblematic of who they are or their level of care or love for me. It just, it was all kind of fear-based. And so it became a little bit antagonistic in the beginning, which caused me to withdraw a little bit more. And as relating to work, there would be, I remember one or two people that came up to me and, are you okay? Everything all right? But by and large, this just wasn't a topic of conversation. It wasn't something we discussed. And I wasn't the only one that was struggling, right? Looking back now, there were a lot of us that are struggling, not just my own agency, but officers at other agencies that I knew. But it was just, it's just one of those things that we just don't talk about.
Well, I think one of the other components of it is you hear the word post-traumatic stress and trauma. And I think for a lot of people, they're going to correlate that with a large event, a single big event. But when you're talking about the mental health aspect, it's just a series of small events that maybe one off, you could easily deal with it, but it's the repetition that law enforcement deals with on a daily basis that doesn't get the acknowledgement.
True. Yeah. I mean, what we know now about it is it can happen from a single event, right? A mass casualty incident, active shooter, something like that. But it's been my experience, and from everything I've learned over the years, is cumulative stress and trauma is really how it, at least I think for me and so many others, how it kind of started. And as a result of that, I was so confused because I didn't understand why I was reacting to the things I was reacting to or responding. I wasn't responding to my stress or trauma or to what people were telling me in a way that was beneficial or helpful or, appropriate. It was, I was very defensive. I was very insecure. I was kind of living a lie. I was putting on a facade. And so that certainly changed me, and that definitely exacerbated the underlying traumas that I was having, right?
What was your outside activities, recreation? Did you have anything that took you away from what you were dealing with?
Yeah, so, early in my career, I had tons of, on my days off, I'd go, do things, movies, I'd work out, I'd play sports, I would hang out with friends. And then, over the course of several years, we'd go debrief, start drinking at bars. We would start to, and that's just it was very culturally acceptable.
My era was called choir practice.
Choir practice, yeah, debriefing. And I had no clue how much worse it made things, because I remember distinctly, being a young explorer and being in a parking lot with a bunch of cops in a small town, opening up a 6-pack, drinking it in the parking lot right outside, right after shift, right? And that's just this culture. We just don't talk about the things that are affecting us. But I had no clue then how detrimental numbing out or just drinking and not talking about things eventually affected me. I had no clue how much that made things worse.
You address a great point in the sense of what the culture of law enforcement does. And one of the things that it builds on, you talk about, debriefing or choir practice, whatever you want to call it, that getting together of all of these officers, and what ends up also becoming common in that is that insulation, because nobody else understands us. And so it just further drives that divisiveness, as opposed to maybe you do need to keep your friends who aren't in law enforcement as that balance. But for so many, they just get in that culture and that's their entire life.
Absolutely. And so common. And I live that. I think a lot do, because I think starts from the academy, right? And when you start to get into your career, you start to realize that no one understands a cop more than another cop, right? And so communication changes between family and friends who are not in law enforcement, because if they haven't been in a uniform or, been in a patrol car, responded to a call, they don't know. They can try to imagine, but they really don't know what it feels like. They don't know what being a police officer feels like and means. And so we do start to kind of alienate ourselves from those people. And that's kind of, well, that's definitely what happened with me. I mean, so you only feel comfortable talking about things, and then you start talking in code, off duty, you're like, copy that. I still sometimes do that. It just becomes, your communication changes, your outlook changes. There's kind of a us versus them thing, right? The way that we live our lives off duty changes constantly, depending on the officer, right? But generally speaking, we got our backs to the wall. If we're in a restaurant, we're scanning the room, we're looking for threats, and that makes our families nervous. And there's transfer trauma that comes from just even energetically coming home after work. And so I think a collection of factors that we've just discussed is kind of what happens in this industry that creates more problems than I think really need to happen. I think that there's so much we could be doing to try to change the industry. Now, I do believe, though, that pure solidarity, that tightness is quintessential. But there has to be more beyond just hanging out with people that are in law enforcement, and having a work-life balance I didn't have that at all.
My honest opinion is it's twofold. It's got to be a culture that starts from the top down in every organization, that mental health is not a weakness. Asking for help is not a weakness. It's not that you've failed at anything. It's merely that you've experienced something that the average person would probably react very negatively to, and we expect you to deal with it every single day of your life.
Right.
Combine that with, like you just said, maintaining that work-life balance, getting yourself outside of that little bubble of only other police officers and thinking that nobody understands me, and that's not the easiest thing to do.
No, not at all. No, it's so interesting too. Like, there's all these different subcultures in our society, right? And the uniqueness of law enforcement is, it's really like unmatched by, I think, by any other subgroup in our society or any other profession. And so, leadership sets the tone. They create the behavior and the culture at their agency. And when we have an agency that prioritizes mental health and sets the tone that, it's okay to not be okay, it can have amazing ripple effects and actually can change morale and how we treat our cops. Because at the end of the day, cops are so resilient. All our first responders, firefighters, correctional officers, EMT, dispatchers. However, it's because, at least in my experience, that level of resilience depletes over time. And
of course,
and I don't think it's reasonable that we expect any first responder to go to a suicide, a child death, be involved in a very, very dangerous or violent confrontation with a suspect, to come home and be okay. Over the course of time, it takes its toll. Even the most resilient warriors are affected with varying degrees. And we come to the profession with different levels of resilience, right? And so there's so many different factors, and we could go down all these different rabbit holes. But at the end of the day, it's in my opinion, it's the responsibility of leadership and command staff to set the tone, to create pathways towards healing, to have a solution for what happens with an officer that becomes affected or goes into crisis, rather than just having a fitness for duty. And we need preventative measures and education and resources on a national way with a national standard, because I think the system is broken completely. And so you can go to one agency and it's normal to talk about mental health, and they can literally go get help without fear of repercussion or having to go to a fitness for duty. And another agency where we're hearing, command staff or chief say, hey, if you need to go to rehab or this, that, you're done. And so it's that stigma that, in my opinion, and from what I've seen and learned, and that stigma that prevents us from getting help. And from there, we start to go down we start to spiral out. We start to, whatever the maladaptive coping strategy is, whether it's numbing out with a substance, alcohol, high-risk sexual behavior, affairs, any high-risk behavior, that's where we start seeing the problems. That's what so many of us have unfortunately experienced, and so that's something that has to change.
I think it's the double-edged sword that is law enforcement, in that administrators are looking for people who can deal with stress, deal with a problem, remain calm, and in that situation, find out a solution. Come to a solution for that situation. And then the double-edged sword aspect of that is I think that because they assume that you can handle that situation, you can handle your stuff. And so historically, mental health and how you are between your ears has never been a priority in law enforcement.
Sure. Well, I mean, look, you go into law enforcement, you take your psych, right? MMPI, you go through all these different tests to make sure that you're sound and that you're emotionally, psychologically, physically fit to do the job, right? And, we even have, government code sections and stuff like that stipulates that you have to be, free of any sort of psychological injury disorder that would prevent you from doing your job, right? So that leads obviously to the stigma, but in my opinion, more can be done. And I've seen it where there's been actually like really successful wellness programs where we can prevent that and use certain incidents and turn it into more of a wellness thing rather than a discipline thing, or have your command staff kind of look at you with a crooked eye and say, oh, wait, you know what? He just said he was kind of depressed, or he said, he's not sleeping, right? Sometimes the immediate reaction is, something's not right, fitness for duty. But how can you expect any human being that wears the job, any human being that wears the badge to consistently go through the countless indignities or critical incidents, the countless hellacious things that we see, and be unaffected? So when you set a tone that says, you better always be, sound, and there better not be anything, wrong, which they don't just say, but it's the culture, right? In the industry, like, who's going to want to go and get help? Who's going to actually want to talk about that, or grab a meet with their partner in the middle of the shift and say, I'm really struggling? Like, who's going to want to do that? If you end up possibly losing everything because of a fitness for duty, a lot of what happens, a lot of command staff, a lot of leadership around the country, when they see someone who's starting to struggle, they look at them as a liability, right? They don't, and they're trying to protect the agency because the primary concern is the community, right? And I think that's...
The opposite to that, though, is if you focus on taking care of the person, guess what? You already then take care of the community and you take care of the agency.
Yeah. Sick cops are not going to engage with the community typically in a way that is beneficial, right, for the agency or the community. Society doesn't benefit from sick cops. So, we've long focused on community-oriented policing and enhancing the relationship between law enforcement and the community. Community-oriented policing in the 80s and the 90s, and tip a cop and coffee with a cop and do, all these different things. And those things have advanced the relationships, right, with the community members in some areas of the country. But by and large, we haven't really taken a hard look at mental health and prioritized it in a way where we can actually see what the outcomes are, right? And I believe that leadership, strong and effective leadership, has direct outcomes, direct causation on mental health outcomes. So, I think if we just took a different stance on leadership or on mental health, we wouldn't be seeing the things that we're seeing. And the stories that we hear are heartbreaking, right? We're sending a message that says it's okay to not be okay. Get help if you need to get help. And a lot of agencies are doing that. But what happens is if we're encouraging them to do that and they do that, well, then they're on the fitness for duty or they're off work. And I'm not saying that's every instance, but it's so much more common than the opposite.
The other thing that's equally important, in my opinion, though, is being a good peer, being a good partner. And you bring up a good point because we've all been there in our law enforcement career. We've all been there car to car, that, late night, middle of the shift, whatever it is. Never once can I ever think back of a conversation of, hey, how are you doing?
Sure. And
how do we get better as partners to do that?
Right. We typically say, hey, you good? You good? And the typical response is like, yeah, good to go. Right. And we're not. And I think that if we as partners didn't judge our partners or our peers as much as we always have, or as we did in the academy or, an FTO or, like we take bets sometimes, right? If someone's going to pass the academy, pass FTO, pass probation. So if we just started to kind of evolve as a law enforcement industry and actually ask probing questions to our partners. Hey, I noticed you've been calling in sick a lot. Hey, how's your wife? how are your kids? Like, what do you, what's going on? How are you? And didn't judge our peers or make them feel inadequate. They'd feel safer opening up, right? And in the peer context of law enforcement, that's everything, right? And so one thing I've learned is that because of the stigma and because of how we sometimes treat each other as peers or the things that we say, it can actually help prevent an officer from isolating because they don't feel good about themselves or they don't feel adequate or as strong as the partner. And when we see that, that becomes the beginning of the downward spiral. If we had partners that lifted us up, didn't make us feel like there was something wrong with us, it could change the ball game. I don't think we always have to wait for leadership. We can have a real influence within our immediate sphere, within our immediate peer group, to have better mental health outcomes. And I can say that, I've experienced this. And I know many others have experienced this. Sometimes we're told by our peers, hey, why is that person bothered? They weren't even there. They didn't even know that person.
But they knew you.
Right.
To say that because somebody wasn't there, they weren't impacted by it. If I'm friends with you and you tell me about a story that when you were working, you almost lost your life, that has an impact on me because I almost lost my friend.
100%. And why shouldn't I, as your partner, as your peer, accept that and want to help you? Right. Well,
that's the other side of that coin in the sense that we like to throw out brother and sister and we got your back and thin blue line. And I agree with it 100%. But we do that for what we seem as the positive or the strength. We never, if somebody's perceived as weak, like you said before, it's like we're sharks and there's blood in the water. We feed on that in a sense, not in a positive way, but in an extremely negative way of just continuing to push that person down.
Absolutely. Great point. Unfortunately, this isn't to be negative. I mean, hopefully this is, something that can be looked at and, thought about. But when there's an officer death or an OAS or, something happens, I've personally experienced this, and someone starts to become emotional. You get sometimes a senior officer that'll start talking shit about that person, right? You think that cop who's affected and now all their peers are making fun of them are ever going to want to be around them ever again? And that thin blue line you're talking about, the law enforcement family, right? in my opinion, should extend to mental health, and you should be there. And if it's off duty and you have the opportunity to try to get to that partner, to try to help them, like that's the thin blue line. That's being there for your partner. It's not just showing up because you're in a foot pursuit or a fight and trying to help them. It extends beyond that, right?
We have to be there as partners in what we deem as the good and what we deem as the bad. You know, somebody's going to be going through something. Maybe you don't understand what they're going through, but you still need to be a good partner. You still need to be a sense of support for that person. Or like you said, going back to, it needs to start with, I truly believe it needs to start with culture. It needs to start with culture of the organization in how everybody is treated. And that starts at the top down. But equally important, we all have to be better partners. We have to be better brothers, sisters, whatever you want to refer to it as, in looking out for those that we work with.
I agree. And it's very interesting because, you know, agency to agency, there's different cultures, right? State to state, county to county, different regions, all these, it's like a melting pot of all these different cultures but by and large, stigma is there and mental health is typically taboo. But in a place, you know, take Fisher's PD in Indiana under the leadership of Chief Ed Gephardt, and the things that he's doing to try to advance mental health at his agency. I mean, when I've been there, the couple times that I've been there, and I've seen how that dynamic directly changes the peer relationship when he normalizes mental health and backs it up with action. You know, he's had opportunities where he could have just gone one way, but went another way, and the outcome of it didn't just help the officer who was struggling, but it's changing the entire culture at the agency, right? And so I think that we are doing a disservice to those that are struggling, and we're losing more than we have to. And in today's environment, with everything that we're seeing in society and what our cops are going through, and especially in these last 2 years, what kind of expectations are we having? What are we really asking of our cops? Really, we're asking them to go into every single situation in society, be society's gatekeepers, right? There's a million expectations of them. The expectations of them are set at a higher standard than the rest of society. And we're expecting them to come home, be okay, have a healthy family life, come back to work the next day, go through more critical incidents. And when they're struggling, we say to them, no fitness for duty. Like, that's it. So, you know, what's the incentive in 2021 to be a police officer with what we're seeing? They're human beings that deserve every single avenue or pathway towards healing that every other human being in society gets and is offered, without judgment, without fear of persecution or any retaliation. And it's going to take a village. It's not Nick, the Resiliency Project. It has to be a nationwide concerted effort, you know, and it starts at the top. It really does. So, you know, you see a lot of, you know, chiefs and command staff. They go to SLI, FBI National Academy. They go every leadership school under the sun. And unfortunately, sometimes when any of those people come back to their agencies, where they're being taught like leadership principles and wellness and all this kind of stuff, mental health, they're not practiced, right? It's something that they use to promote or advance their own career. And I'm not saying that's every time, but from the things I've seen or experienced, we are really missing the mark.
It's a larger number than it should be.
It's a much larger number than it should be, yeah. And we have to start doing the right things for the right reasons. And we have to start being critical thinkers, right? You know, you can't just, in my opinion, yes, like in California, we have a government code section, right? You got to be free of all psychological, okay. And if you're not, or if there's just mere, you know, reasonable suspicion that there might be an issue, you can go to a fitness for duty, which could potentially end your career, right? Don't our cops who are sacrificing everything, who are for what, don't they deserve every opportunity to get help? I think what happens is when a police officer experiences the wrath and scorn, not just of society, but then from within their organization, and they start to feel or experience organizational betrayal, whether it's real or perceived, that's the most common thing, I think, that exasperates all mental health issues, all the underlying mental health issues. And I think that nothing really can kill a cop more than betrayal, because of how we enter the career and what that thin blue line stands for and what they are, how they set us up to go into this profession. This is something that Dr. John Violanti discusses when I went to a trauma retreat. This was the primary focus, right? We know we're going to go see death, destruction, this, that, and that. What we don't ever think when we start our career is that the very thin blue line family and the very department that we're working for and risking our lives every day to serve the community for is going to do something that they don't have to do, that adversely affects us. And when they feel betrayed, it changes the entire way that they think about the profession and what they were taught and told, right? And so, this is a very complex thing, but it's really not. We just have to start doing the right thing. We just have to start treating our cops from command staff down as human beings. Now, obviously, there are people who are affected so much that they no longer can do the job, right? And that's a different thing. I just think that we can do more to save those that need saving, if they can be saved, before we end up retiring them out, fitness for duty. They're medically retired, and that's it. They're an afterthought. And that's what happens with law enforcement and retirement, whether it's a regular service retirement or medical retirement. By and large, you're an afterthought, and you're no longer part of that family.
No, usually when you walk out the door, everybody says, "Oh, we'll talk to you. See you later." And a week goes by, and maybe a few people call. A month goes by, a few less people call, and by a year or so later, you're forgotten.
That's a pretty generous amount of time. It's I've experienced way shorter amount of time here, but this is another factor to it, because I was telling you I didn't have a work-life balance, right? I was married to the job. The badge was my identity, which is not healthy, right? That was it. Nick the cop. And that's a very dangerous thing, I think, for any police officer to be. And so it's kind of sad when you think about that. And this is, many cops are like that, right? Many cops identify with the badge, and that's their identity. But
briefly, going back and looking at it in hindsight, at that time, did you ever have the point where to yourself you felt that wasn't normal, or for you that you were good to go? Nick the cop.
Nick the cop. That was my purpose for being here on Earth. It was because, and you always hear, and you hear it in the academy, the job chooses you, right? It's not just a job. This is a calling. This is, and there's something to that. But at the end of the day, it is also just a job. Okay. But when you're young and you're impressionable and you believe in, justice, and you believe in what the profession stands for, and you're reciting the code of ethics, and you're, thin blue line, and we're going to go protect the innocent and the weak against deception, and all these different things, right? It's almost like an indoctrination process, not in a malicious or evil way, but, they're preparing you to go out into the unknowns in our society and be able to go into any situation or critical incident and expect a positive outcome, right? So I think one of the challenges that we're seeing is that we have a situation right now in our country where you've got people who are going down that path, and that's what they believe, which is what I believed. And the trauma that is left untreated from critical incidents starts to permeate into our lives. And when we don't feel supported by our own, or we feel like we are too afraid to ask for help, then we retire, whether it's service or just, and then we don't hear from anybody, or they strip away from us our career because of a fitness for duty. It challenges our entire understanding and concept of what it means to be a police officer. And that betrayal bleeds into our family life, right? And that can also, if there are no plans in place, or you're not prioritizing your mental health or have a self-care plan or strategy, is part of one of the contributing factors that leads to all the divorces and the high-risk behavior and the extramarital affairs, the substance abuse. We're killing ourselves.
You just hit on so many of the topics that I loosely say this are joked about in law enforcement: divorce, alcohol abuse, all infidelity. Even just having that as a topic of conversation indicates that the job needs a reboot.
Total reboot.
Now, you pile onto that the number of suicides that we're seeing. It's just another example of how we're not addressing the officers as people. They're looked at as the robots, so to speak, who can go out and deal with a problem, but nobody's thinking about, wait a minute, when they come back home, how are they dealing with their problems?
Yeah, it's everything, right? And the very thing, to expand on that, the very thing that we need the most to heal is our family and our social structures. But it's the one thing that we push away and alienate sometimes, because that's what happens with trauma. That's what happens with, when we get off work, we just want to shut down. What happens with most cops? They don't want to make a decision, right? They, sometimes their spouses will say, hey, where do you want to go to dinner? Where should we do that? And you're just fried. You got the burnout. You've got all these different things that are working against our own mental health, our physical health, right? And over the course of time, we start to break down. Our decision-making starts to be affected. The lens through which we see the world changes. Our role within the world changes. Our concept of what our entire purpose is changes. And when we feel this betrayal and all the uncertainty over the course of time, I'm speaking, generally speaking, at least this was, with me, like you lose your purpose. When you lose your purpose, you lose your hope. And so it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. I've honestly, looking back, I can't believe that there's, in 2021, with what we're seeing in the country, that we have done nothing in a concerted, streamlined, standardized fashion to prioritize mental health with real solutions to fix this problem. Because it's our workforce, which is everything, right? Your people are everything. And if they're not well, if they're, getting divorces and they're just exhibiting all this high-risk behavior, and then this bleeds not just to the family life, but to the citizens that we're supposed to be serving. I mean, we got to start thinking a little bit more outside the box and start being a little bit more accepting of the fact that even if you work in a small town where you're not having violence and chaos every single shift, just putting the uniform on and going, out on the street, you're constantly in a situation where you're at a level 10, right? Not a level 10, but I mean, you have that hypervigilance and officer safety, and it's exhausting. So we all respond differently to trauma, but we're missing the mark, I think. And there's a lot more we could be doing, and there's a lot of ideas out there. But I think that command staff, leadership, chiefs, and even legislatively, we have to reframe the way that we think about fitness for duties. There is a role, there's a place for that, right? But usually speaking, we don't have to wait till it gets that bad, Well,
it's like you said earlier, it is a profession that chooses you. And there are some people that they are meant for law enforcement. There are some people who are not. And if you're not, that an agency can't put a Band-Aid on that. If this isn't for you, if you can't, you have to be able to deal with stressful situations. That's what the job is about. You can't be in a situation where, hey, I need you to maintain your composure right now. Granted, when the situation's done, 30 minutes behind, we can talk about it then, but I need you to maintain your composure now. There are some people that isn't them. But at the same token, just because you can deal with this situation right now, an agency and our peers need to make sure that it's the 30 minutes later, hey, are you okay? Are you dealing with it all right? And that's what we need to get better at.
I agree. In the peer context of everything, yeah, we have to start being a lot more supportive, less judgmental, more understanding about how traumatic stress can impact our life and the way that we respond to things, right? But, at the end of the day too, like, if we don't have strong and effective leadership that are supportive of mental health, if we don't have strong and ethical decision-making at a leadership level, which directly impacts the course and trajectory sometimes of police officers' careers and livelihood, I mean, we're going to start losing more and more cops like we are today for a variety of factors. And we're not going to be hiring the right kind of cops. Okay. And so that's something that scares me. And, we want all this, like, it's funny that we demand as a society almost perfection from our police officers. And those people that are demanding perfection are all imperfect people. And so are our command staff and leadership. So it's like, at the end of the day, I just think that, hopefully there can be a true paradigm shift where we reframe the way that we respond to our troops, our workforce, and come up with really progressive and positive avenues to deal with people who are struggling. And I think at the end of the day that if we're not going to do that, if we're not going to give everything that we can to improve the mental health of those that are sacrificing everything, those leaders shouldn't be in those positions, because you're doing everyone a disservice. Your own department, the morale, the families of the police officers who are sacrificing everything, in the community. The stories that we hear, sometimes I can't even, and our team, we can't even wrap our heads around what we're hearing. And it's sad. It's heartbreaking. Our police officers deserve, all first responders deserve the absolute best treatment. You can't go, in my opinion, an entire career and come out unscathed. And we go into this profession thinking that this is going to be it. Like, we're going to stay from academy to retirement. We never think outside the box, typically speaking. Like, what are we going to do if I get hurt? What's plan B? What's the next step for me? The identity is the badge, the profession.
Well, one of the ancillary things for my podcast, though, is to get people kind of thinking about that what if, but I'm not going to derail you on that. The one thing I will say, though, is the way I look at it is it's about a relationship. You've got people coming in the door wanting to be a police officer, and they're giving you their half of the relationship. As an agency, they're expecting the same in return. I don't care if it's a husband and wife or a police officer and their agency. If both sides aren't giving equally into the relationship's going to fail. So agencies need to take care of their officers as much as their officers need to take care of their agencies. It's got to work together. And to be out there on an island by yourself, or at least perceived as being on an island by yourself, you're destined to fail.
True. Yeah, I agree. Well, and I also think that, look, this isn't anything new, right? I think, leadership and its direct correlation to mental health outcomes has always been a thing, right? And it is, I think, in every job, every profession, but there is a uniqueness to law enforcement because of everything that we've just discussed and the culture, right? I believe that we're seeing in the last year to 2 years something very different and a very different shift. And I believe that from everything we've learned and heard and seen, that the problem is getting worse in many places around the country. And I'm not about politics. I'm not about, like, I don't care, where anyone's at with that. But I do believe that there are external forces that absolutely influence decision making. And when that happens, you've just unfortunately ruined things, not just for the officer you're making a decision about, but your entire agency. And there are just certain things that shouldn't be happening. I think we need leadership that is going to stand tall and protect the troops if they do the right thing and they're within policy. And you know what the common thing we hear? I was within policy, but it just didn't look good. Well, no use of force looks good, right? We need leadership to have political courage today, because everything's on the line. And if we set precedent and not support the troops because of these external forces, you're going to have more officers getting injured, which we hear all the time, because they're not going to want to defend themselves or use force. They're worried about getting prosecuted. They're worried about, unusual media attention. They're worried about all these different things. So now it's changing our tactics on the street in many cases, right? So this is exasperating even more mental health issues. And I would say 99% of the calls that we hear, it's all about betrayal, real or perceived, organizational betrayal. And that's why leadership's so important. They set the tone. So strong and ethical and effective decision-making is leadership who prioritizes mental health and creates pathways towards healing and lets their troops know it's okay to not be okay. We're just not going to stay that way, and we're going to get you help. Right? Don't they deserve that opportunity? Because what I've seen before it gets too late, I've seen in so many cases people actually get help and be able to come back to work. They're being re-triggered all the time when they drive by a situation where there was an OIS or a partner of theirs that were shot, or a child death every single shift. So how do you heal in a profession that you're constantly the next day going to, constantly being re-triggered in an environment that's so judgmental, and there's so much fear of what would happen to you if you ask for help? The rules almost have been set in opposition, right? It's not reasonable to expect what we're seeing with our cops, especially not between 2020 and 2021.
Well, that's why, if it was up to me, I would like to see it where mental health counseling is mandatory. Just it should be a component of the same way you have to go to the range and qualify with your gun, the same way you have to learn how to drive a car. You have to go to mental health counseling.
Should be absolutely viewed as a perishable skill. They should be getting ongoing and continuing training and mandating yearly, at minimum, yearly check-ins. Not an evaluation, not a fitness for duty, but at least a yearly check-in. Because then you remove stigma. If you remove the decision for an officer to go, right? They have to go. They're all going to go. Then you're starting to normalize this over the course of time. It's just going to be part of the program. If you leave it up to the officer, no one's going to go. Right. So, and if we start teaching cops that to have a life outside of the job early on, right, in a more standardized fashion. If we started thinking about different things like neurofeedback, brain scans to assess the changes in our brains, right? We can actually, like, in a predictive way, learn how to not intervene, but start providing resources and help to to minimize or mitigate what happens to our brains when they're affected by trauma. It's a psychological injury, just like a broken leg, just like a broken arm, okay, that you get in a fight or a foot pursuit. You can now see brain scans that are affected by trauma and what happens with untreated trauma. So why don't we start making, we could have so many different treatment modalities and options, but we're so laser focused as a society on what our cops are doing, what our cops are not doing, how they handled something, and we're beating them to the ground. Now, I'm the first to advocate for an officer who doesn't deserve to wear the badge to get him out, right? But unfortunately, in my opinion, we're seeing good cops whose careers have been ended. They didn't have to be ended. And this goes between culture and society and in the way that we are handling things in this industry. And it's also the external forces that are affecting decision-making at the top. So we have to somehow reprioritize the way that we're looking at how to treat our police officers, how we have, different organizational behaviors that actually are productive, and how we deal with external issues from the society that is demanding so much, where we have seen so much destruction and chaos in the last 2 years.
Well, and I keep coming back to it. It all comes back down to taking care of your people. Be empathetic and take care of your people. You can look at not every other entity, but the football league, for instance. They've changed the way the game is played because you have to look at the person and their long-term health and the damage that's getting done to their brains from hard impacts. The military is already showing that many of our soldiers are coming back with significant brain injury from blasts and exposure to concussion, blasts from explosions. The same way with law enforcement. We're keeping your head buried in the sand and thinking that these men and women experience trauma on a daily basis and it doesn't have a lasting impact on their mental health is negligent.
Agreed.
To put it mildly.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything, I think personally, in my life and everything that I see, and especially with what our amazing team sees, I don't think that there's anything more grotesque than seeing a leadership making decisions to maybe pacify or satisfy whatever group or entity that they're trying to, and be so easily willing to throw a cop's career away. And it's interesting, law enforcement is supposed to be apolitical, right? But I think that there's almost an egregious thing that we're seeing, an egregious trend. And by and large, the majority of the stories that we hear or when we're teaching or speaking or anything like that, it all comes back to this. This is the number one complaint of our police officers from what I hear and see and experience, right? Of course people are going to struggle with critical incidents. I'll be honest with you. I cried for one time on duty and I at a child death. And I thought oh my gosh, I'm weak. I couldn't believe that I cried on duty. I had to remove myself from the situation and all that stuff. Right. And don't get me wrong. Everything that happened to me in my life, this was my fault. Okay. Because I'm the one that chose to numb out and all that kind of stuff. But, in so many cases, we could do a lot more to prevent these things from happening, because what's happening is command staff making decisions that sends a message to every other officer there in the department,
Well, going back to your example though, so that's a prime example of the culture of the industry. Yeah. The fact that a child died and you were struck with it emotionally, which a normal person would find that is the appropriate response, but yet you felt you needed to walk away. So our culture enables or encourages a lack of emotion, which completely is counterintuitive to how we are as human beings.
Totally. You just brought a really good point. Like, imagine, and when I say this, I mean, everything should be within reason, right? I'm not saying that, a cop should be having a total meltdown on the call, right? But, the
profession still requires you to maintain your composure in a given situation.
Absolutely. But I also believe that there would be, if you become emotional and shed a tear when you're on scene at a call while the parents are weeping and the members are there, and you hear the whelping, the screaming, the agonizing pain of something that's tragic, you shed a tear rather than try to hold it back. That would not only help the officer because they have to stuff it, but it could create a situation where there's a connection between the victims and the officer, which would improve community relations, because when you're crying and sobbing as a victim and the officer's just like, yeah, just the facts. How do you think the victims feel, right? We have to start becoming more compassionate and understanding and start humanizing what we're talking about, instead of just having a hashtag and a slogan so that the agencies can say, oh no, look, this is what we do. Like, we support it. Their actions say everything, right? So, don't get me wrong. Like, I'm not some screw admin everywhere, right? But it's such a big deal that it has to be acknowledged. And so I know that it's not a perfect world, and we're not going to have every single police chief or command staff be, what we expect them to be. But there needs to be some hard changes if we want our society to change.
Well, to use the military analogy of, you don't turn a battleship quickly. It's going to take some time, but we got to start turning the steering wheel. And I will say, in my opinion, we are turning the steering wheel. It's just, it's going to take more time to really see the ramifications of that. For the most part, I do honestly believe that the culture is still very much, hey, deal with your own, and don't cry over spilled milk, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree, and I just I can't happen but to I can't help but to think of how tough it is to be in law enforcement today. When we hear the stories, when we hear like real, legitimate career cops who have had just an impeccable career, and you're on the phone with them, and you're seeing their tears, and you're seeing them break down, and they feel so worthless because they don't know how they got there, what's wrong with them. That is shameful that we've gotten so far as a society, like, away from having a compassionate understanding of the human response to critical incidents. It's tragic because the team, our whole team, when they're peer supporting, or me, when I'm talking to someone, I tell them, there's nothing wrong with you. You're a human being. This is normal, right? And you've held it in so long that you're unraveling, and now you don't know why, because we've never been taught how to deal with this, right? And it's frustrating because, unfortunately, we're getting these calls, unfortunately, like when it's already, a crisis, right? We're not getting the calls, well, I just can't sleep. It's like they're here. And that's the leadership's responsibility to change that. But I think it's incumbent upon us all, from our peers, in every single component of an agency, to outside organizations, both public and private, to work together, because this is going to take a village. It shouldn't be just one organization. We should all be working together to do the right thing for the right reasons. Unfortunately, we're not. And so what are we doing? I mean, we can talk about this all day long on podcasts, radio. We can make videos. I mean, we can do all these different things, but until we start actually taking action steps to effectuate change, the problem is going to continue to permeate. We've got cops now who in my opinion, and the opinion of, people that we work with, who should not be getting charged with crimes, but are, because of what's going on in society today. This is a very real thing. People are getting, prosecuted unjustly. So what does that do to a cop who believes in fairness and equality under the law? Who, you're taught from day one, it's just as important to exonerate an innocent person as it is to prosecute or hold liable a guilty person. And so when you see what we're seeing, because of politically motivated agendas, you're ruining the morale of our cops. They don't want to do their job. They're afraid to go to work. So right now, in many places in the country, they're just showing up to work hoping that they don't have to use force, hoping and praying that they're not going to get caught on camera doing their job protecting the community, and having it twisted and made to look like something else. Don't get me wrong. There are a lot of cases where there's excessive force. There's all these different things, right? Those have to be handled because we cannot break trust with the community. But if we really want to improve that, we can't buckle under the political pressures or politically motivated agendas from these external forces, because you're ruining the department. They don't want to do their job. Just the other day, we heard a story about, multiple officers being injured out of fear of doing their jobs appropriately, using reasonable force, because of what has happened to their colleagues, either being terminated and losing their careers under an excessive force complaint, or being prosecuted by a DA at essentially the direction of the agency, because they want to go absolve their hands from something because, oh my gosh, some sort of group is going to have a panic attack or respond. No, stand tall for your troops. Send the message. And you're sending the message not just to the troops, but to the community, because we're seeing parts and fractions of the community becoming empowered by policies that are driven at the legislative level, right? Or the DA level. And, as a result, you're seeing the statistics with crime increasing. Cops aren't going to go out there and be proactive. If just like that, they're going to lose everything. So this is how could this not impact mental health?
It has a huge impact. It has a huge impact on how you feel when you head out every day, put your uniform on, and go do your job.
Yeah. And when we know I'm retired now, right? But, police officers, and this is research, Dr. John Violanti, I think, coined this term, but police officers' moral compass, it typically points towards justice and benevolence. The psychological profile of a police officer typically believes in goodness, fairness, right? We don't have, a nationwide problem where we've got thousands of police officers just waking up every day going, okay, whose rights can we go violate? Who can we just go beat down? I've never experienced that. I've met some bad cops, right? And they're no good. They stain the rest of the profession. But there's a narrative, unfortunately, and it's unfortunately impacting decision-making, policies, procedures, organizational behavior. And when a police officer who goes into the profession with honor and believes in equal justice under the law and fairness, and then starts to experience themselves the exact opposite, with already how difficult the job is to do, this is so significant because of what they believe from day one, the thin blue line, the family, got your back, got your six, that goes out the window. And if their identity is the badge, imagine then, once they're affected, their concept of life, if it's all completely challenged, they're looking at me like I thought this was my family. And in many cases, law enforcement officers are closer to their own partners than their families. which is not good or healthy, right? So there's just a collection of things that I think that all of us could be doing to change the environment that we're in, but it's going to take courage and leadership. I agree at the peer level, we could do so much more, but we got to get serious because we have watched suicides be the number one cause of law enforcement death, not line of duty, that minus the last year, right?
Right.
And
the numbers are continuing to grow.
True. And there, isn't that strange too, that all of a sudden just in 2020 and 2021, law enforcement officer deaths in the line of duty have skyrocketed, what, by gunfire or by being assaulted by suspects? It's not traffic accidents. So there's a reason for that, in my opinion. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole because
that's a different political podcast.
It's a different podcast. But at the end of the day, we do have to acknowledge that there is something to this as it relates to mental health. And, we can do a better job because our troops, our police officers, they deserve the best, in my opinion. I mean, they're out there sacrificing. They're giving everything they got, expected to be damn near perfect. And many cases, they're getting a slap in the face. And this directly impacts so many things. If we want better community relations, fewer suicides, less divorces, improved morale, we have to reshape the way that we treat our cops and create solutions based on research and the understanding of what outcomes are possible when we get them into either treatment or get them from a preventative way, and, have real wellness programs, have real peer support teams where you're choosing people on the team that are not just trying to promote and have something on the resume, no, people who understand the importance of confidentiality, who really want to be there for their partners. So it's a collection of factors, I think. And I get a little bit passionate sometimes, so forgive me. But if you hear that, it's because there is a feeling sometimes of hopelessness and helplessness that comes with peer supporting people who, this isn't the profession I remember, right? What we're seeing in the last 2 years, right? I mean, I've experienced organizational betrayal, whether it was real or perceived, right? A lot of people I know have, but I think, I just think that they're heroes. I think our police officers are absolute heroes. Our firefighters, correctional officers, our dispatch, all of them are heroes, and we need them, and we need the best. We can't afford as a society subpar or mediocre. We need the best. So how are we going to get the best if we're not treating them like they're the best?
So speaking about your passion, let's get into the Resiliency Project. But briefly, I'd like to talk about how you got to your, let's call it, bottom line or end of the road, so to speak, for law enforcement that forced you down this new path.
Yeah. I unfortunately let what others thought of me be my guiding, principle, and the fear of the stigma that prevented me from getting help. That was me, right? And then I started to numb out, and I ended up crashing my car, getting a DUI when I was off duty. My rock bottom.
Did you end up having to go to treatment for that?
Yeah, I got, this is towards the very end of my career. And I already had all the surgeries, and my body was already I'm in my 30s, but I feel like an 80-year-old man, right? But beyond that, there was the underlying post-traumatic stress stuff. And so, yeah, I went to treatment after that. I had to basically put in for retirement because I was done, both physically and at the time I needed to heal emotionally, psychologically. but physically, like I was done. I knew that I couldn't really serve my partners if I couldn't, hold a door for hours on end, or help them in a fight, which presents its own issues. But I think that I was going to say I went to treatment. I went to 7 days to detox, 30-day inpatient, 2 weeks outpatient. Surprisingly, that's where I realized I wasn't alone. There were 45% of the people I was at treatment with were all cops and firefighters, but primarily cops. And I was like, oh wow, I'm not alone. Like we called ourselves the degenerates, made fun of ourselves, trying to figure out how the hell we got there. But really where my healing journey started was going to a trauma retreat and understanding the uniqueness of first responder trauma, and being able to actually for the first time participate in critical incident debriefing and EMDR and dialectical behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, all forms of exposure therapy, neurofeedback.
Is it a retreat specifically for first responders?
Yeah, there's one in Northern California, and they're building more around the country. And there's another one that we're excited to be potentially partnering with, all of which deal with the uniqueness of law enforcement trauma with culturally competent clinicians who understand it. And, that's a whole nother topic. But, when I retired, I ended up working at two different for a very short time, a couple different treatment places, and started learning a lot about the treatment world. And that's another thing that is a huge factor in treating our law enforcement, because if we don't have cultural competence with our clinicians, you can do a lot more damage than good. You can hurt them more than good if they're not culturally competent. For instance, if you and I are, partners, and we're out on a dead body call, right? And it's just us, and we're waiting for the coroner. We might be cracking jokes or talking about something of the weekend, right? To kind of diffuse what we're seeing and experiencing. So like culturally, like sometimes we have a dark sense of humor, right? In law enforcement. If your clinician is not culturally competent and sees that, for instance, this is a micro example, right? But we have seen it, the clinician could potentially respond to that person by thinking that something's wrong with them, further deteriorating the mental health of the officer who's already struggling, making them feel like something's wrong, when that's, whether it's right or wrong, that's what we learn, right? And that's how we learn to try to, humor. So we need cultural competence, and I think the treatment industry is a whole nother subject and topic. But if law enforcement agencies worked and partnered with outside entities like that, like LAPD, they have a whole unit dedicated to getting their cops into treatment, which is fabulous. It's great, but we need that nationwide, and we need more treatment facilities for both chemical dependency and for just trauma, for those that are not chemically dependent, to be working together. So it takes a village, I think.
What was your impetus, though, to actually go forward and create the Resiliency Project?
Because I felt alone when I was going through what I was going through. I thought something was wrong with me. And my life became unraveled. I had, when I hit rock bottom after that, I didn't have a plan B. I hated myself. And at the end of the day, I never wanted anyone to feel alone. And like, this wasn't like a plan that I had right after, right? Like it took a couple of years to even come up with the idea of it. But in working in the treatment industry for a short amount of time, and then seeing the need, maybe I was being a little bit too idealistic, but I was like, maybe I could take the idea of like making videos, which was part of my new self-care thing. I learned how to make these videos. I could try to destigmatize things in law enforcement, or make a video that shows our understanding and support, telling our cops that we hear them and what they're going through with whatever is going on in society, to try to improve their mental health, and to let them know that they're not alone and that we're here for them. And I decided, like, what if we had awesome people on a team that could take calls at 24/7, right? And peer support them. And then if clinical intervention is needed, like create relationships with the right clinicians or treatment companies and get them there, and then raise money if they don't have the right kind of insurance or funds to go through a program, with the long-term goal of building our own campus. And our own campus, once we build it, is going to have, one part of it for chemical dependency and the other part for just trauma based on the places that I went through. And if their insurance doesn't cover that, right, then we're going to make sure that they go for free. We're trying to do everything we can to remove any single excuse to not get help, to prevent suicide. And, at the end of the day, it's given me purpose. And I'm so grateful that there are the people now that are in my life and that are on this team who are mission oriented, doing the right things for the right reasons, who care as much as I do, because they themselves have been impacted by trauma, And so we're creating, I think, a community of understanding, and we know we can't do it alone. We have to work with other people. We want to work with other people, as long as they're right-minded and want to do the right things for the right reasons. For me, the Resiliency Project has become my mission. And for as hard as it is to hear some of the things that we hear, it's making me stronger because, and every team member stronger, because we're not going backwards. Right. We're learning how to deal with it, right? And there's something cathartic about being able to help someone when you're hurting, And so beautiful things have happened since then. And I think that with the grants that we're writing, with the amazing board we have, our peer support director, Kip Curtis, and Louis Giampavolo, who's our board member, and Cheyenne, who is an amazing human being and is essentially holds this thing together, to my fiance, who I met because life turned around and I started developing healthy, good relationships, and she's an angel, to my son.
But this all started from you by yourself, or did you have an initial team?
No, I never had social media, right? My whole life. And then when I retired, I created one, Resiliency Project, because resilience is what we need to survive, right? And that's what depletes. So I called it the Resiliency Project. And then I thought, what if I turn this into a nonprofit? And then met the right people to help me get there, because I'm not a business guy. I don't know when I was a cop, right? And then it just started to kind of formalize as we were going, and it's definitely changed and molded based on the needs of what we were seeing. I mean, I was scared shitless. I'm like, oh my gosh, someone actually reached out, right? I'm like, this is crazy. And there's a responsibility to know, how, when we say you're not alone, we better answer the phone, right? So what to do. So then we brought on an amazing trainer. I met, through Kip, we met Charlie Gross, who's sergeant for the state, who, does our training, and just started meeting the right people. And I think at the end of the day, we continue to evolve and try to improve, because we're not perfect. We never will be. And we have to get better and grow our team. And when we get about, 50 to 60 peer supporters, the other plan that we have, aside from the campus, is to be able to respond at the request of an agency for mutual aid if they don't have peer support, or they get inundated anywhere around the country. If it's mass casualty, if it's whatever it is, right? To be there for them, boots on the ground, even if it's just having a little tent and handing them water, right? Whatever needs to happen, but we have to start doing more and getting proactive. And so that's kind of where we're at. Yes, it was my idea. Yes, I started it, but it wasn't me. It was everyone around me who are just angels and blessings that actually make it work. Okay. So,
how big is your team grown to today?
I think we have 19 on our team now. We have, as of last night, I think 8 in the application process. We just wrote a grant with this amazing psychological services company in Central California. And I believe we're going to get that grant. And when we do, we're going to be expanding and doing more crisis response around the country. I don't want us to grow too fast. We're trying to grow as fast as we can, but not so fast that we're bringing on the wrong people, because I believe our cops, our first responders, everyone that we serve deserves the best that they can get. And I think it takes a certain kind of personality and profile to be able to withstand the kinds of things that we hear and be all in for the mission. Because, and think about it, like how amazing it is and how blessing it is to have a team who, whether they're active or retired, have been through so much of their own stuff in their careers and their own personal lives, to be able to answer a phone.
So one of the questions I have is all of your team former first responders?
Oh yeah. Everyone who's a peer supporter, they're either active or retired. And I think most of them are active. So yeah,
So when somebody reaches out, they have the confidence to know that the other person on the other end of that phone is going to be able to relate.
You have to, right? Otherwise, how do you get the trust and the understanding? If we just hired someone that worked at, a department store, it's not going to work. They need someone that they can trust and that knows that they've been where the person who's calling has been. And so, they're all first responders, most of them law enforcement. I just know more cops, but
right.
We're trying to increase the fire side and dispatchers and stuff like that. We have regular civilians on the team that are just regular, volunteers that are just ardent supporters of the first responder community. And then, other people who help and pitch in when they can, when we get inundated with calls. Since we started in April 2020, we've peer supported over 500. And we also support their spouses, right? And as of right now, we're supporting between, I think, 80 and 90 actively. And we're telling them, like, you can call 24/7 whenever you need. And so we are getting to a point where we have to start bringing on a lot more to be able to sustain the calls that we're getting. And it's directly attributable, I think, to what we're hearing and seeing around the country.
If there are any first responders who want to help and participate, what can they do?
We would be so grateful if they could apply and contact us through our website, www.theresiliencyproject.info.
Do they need to come to the table with any special skills or? Yeah,
we preferably people who have been on the job for a while, right? Who are, seasoned first responders, and who have sheer integrity, compassion, understanding, who are good listeners, and we need people who are able to withstand the things that we're hearing and to be able to work as a team. We just need people to do the right things for the right reasons, and we do need help. We need a lot of peer supporters, and we need staff, right, to help support the endeavors that we're doing, and the because we've got fundraisers and we've met like amazing people who believe in the mission, who are helping us to raise money so that we can pay for any treatment modality that we can to keep these first responders alive. We don't take a salary. We're all volunteers. And so I think that's an important factor in this, because they understand that this is bigger than us. This is bigger than me or you. This is bigger than our team. This is bigger than all of us. And I think that and that's an important factor.
For somebody who's in need, how do they reach out?
They go through the website, www.theresiliencyproject.info, and there's a Get Support button there. And then our peer support director or someone from the peer support team reaches out, and they start the process.
Is it via phone call, via text, via email?
The actual conversation?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The initial conversation, because we ask sometimes, like, when's the best time to call? Because maybe they're at work, they don't want to know that we're calling. And so it'll either be a text, an email, or a phone call. And most of us, but I always I FaceTime. I don't know why that is. I always have to see who I'm talking to. But when we peer support, unless we're around them, it's on Zoom or FaceTime. And if clinical intervention is needed, like I said, we'll find them a clinician and then peer support them as well while they're going through any sort of treatment. And usually what happens is once they've gotten the help that they need, they don't need as many calls or conversations because we have to teach them to learn how to live their lives now, right? So it's just an amazing journey and process, but we're learning every day. I'm learning every day from the team and, their experience. And I mean, these people are amazing. And so each of them make us better.
So in wrapping it up, somebody listening to this feels that they need help. What's your pieces of advice, or what would be the last things you'd like to kind of wrap up with?
It's okay to not be okay. Don't let any fear that you have at your agency prevent you from getting help. Know that if you can't get help from within the agency, there are other organizations like ours out there that are super passionate about helping them, and to contact us and not wait before it gets so bad that they become self-destructive or start losing more than they have to, because the more we wait, the more we lose. So contact us. You're not alone. We want our message out there. We want them to know that they can call us. We're confidential. We're free. We're 24/7, and that they're not alone, and that they're heroes and they deserve the kind of support that we want to give them. And so I'd say this in closing, there's, in my opinion, in our organization's opinion, there's nothing more emblematic of strength. There's no greater example of being a warrior than being able to look within, recognize you need to get the help you need, and then actually doing it. That's strength. That's being a warrior, because you're overcoming the stigma that permeates throughout this profession that has unfortunately caused more loss than we ever needed to experience. So they're not alone. We love them. We appreciate their service. We're grateful for them, and we're here for them.
I appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate you watching. But before you go, if you like the video, please hit that subscribe button. Also, any comments are appreciated. Thank you.